Hi, my name is Adam, and I'm leading a local front-end study group that takes place online. Although the meetings themselves are for locals, I want the knowledge to be shared with as many people as possible, so I've started recording our sessions to upload to YouTube. This video, or activity as I like to call it, is an introduction to the BEM naming methodology and SCSS as well as the features that it gives us. We are following along with the front-end study repository, which can be found in the description, along with some other helpful information. Throughout this uploading process, I've noticed some of my own errors and inconsistencies, so I know that I have some things that I can work on that will make me an even better teacher. With that being said, please feel free to give me any of your own feedback on any area that you think I did well or poorly. So thank you for watching my introduction, and I hope you learn a thing or two. And yes, what I was going to say, BEM. On the front page of this repository, the main index file, you'll see here the naming methodology. This is if you want to go, we're not going to go all this in depth with BEM. It also shows you some of the competitors and whatnot. I'm just going to go over it at a high level and kind of show you, and then it's kind of something you just have to read on your own. But it's here. It's in the repository. So whenever you do have time and you want to go in depth and read it, this is the introduction. It's not very in depth, as you can see. It's really just a short page. So, and there's more further reading as well. So that's as far as you want to go with it. You go for it. So, who is completely, raise your hand if you're completely unfamiliar with BEM and like what it is and everything. Okay, so we got 4 or 5. Okay, so BEM is not a framework. It's nothing like that. It's nothing that you download to your project. It is literally just a methodology. It's just a way it's a specific way to name your classes on your components, if you will. So like I said, I'm not gonna read this whole thing. If you want to read the intro description word for word, how they put it, go for it. But essentially all it is name. So I'm gonna go ahead and go into the code and show you guys. So in the starter files, I'm in SCSS and BEM. Also, let me know if this is too small for you guys. I want to make sure you can like see the code well enough. I'll try this. This is a little big for me, but we'll see if it works out well. So in the starter files, I've kind of already done the BEM. If you want to start over from scratch, or if you want to clear the classes out and do your own thing, that's perfectly fine, but you'd have to change the styles as well, which again is perfectly fine. So I've kind of already done it. And essentially what BEM is it stands for block, element, and modifier. As you can see here, block, element, and modifier. What BEM tries to help with is, you can see it here, it says how to scale and maintain legacy CSS. That's kind of what it's trying to do. It's for scalability and maintainability. You'll see that the block is a parent level element at the top level. So for instance, we have our big section of content. That is technically a block, but this inside of that, we have our another block, which is called loop blocks. Pretend that this is its own component. It's called loop blocks and whatever. So you have loop blocks, which is the block. And you typically do hyphens. You don't do camel case. You can do camel case. That's just opinion, whatever. If you want to do camel case class names, that's fine. But essentially, you have your block class name, and then every child of that block is going to be denoted by 2 underscores, and then whatever you want to call it. So, for instance, I have loop blocks. Each one of these is going to be a loop blocks block. And then another instance to go a little deeper. Let's say I'm going to close these just so it's easier to see what's going on. All right, so we have our loop blocks here. Now to show you a little bit of a deeper level BEM methodology, we have card list, which is just a list of cards. So we have card list, and we have card list denoted by 2 underscores. We have card list item. Inside of those items, we have a few things inside of those items. So again, it's another element inside of that main block. So you would just do 2 more underscores. So like I said, it's no framework. It's nothing like that. It's just a specific way of naming your classes and how to do it. And it's to be maintainable. It's to be consistent and maintainable, so you know what's going on. And it also helps. So for instance, let's just go to the activity. If you haven't seen it yet, this is the activity. This is kind of what we're building. It's really nothing too special. These are kind of practical, but this is just an example to use for loops in SCSS. But this is what we're building. And to give you an example, if I were to try to debug this, if I didn't build this right off the bat, and I were a developer coming in and trying to figure out what component this is, so I can go into the styles or go into the file structure and find it in all the components, I can look in the inspector, easy peasy, and I see, look, it's card list. So in my mind, with a proper SCSS architecture, I know that I'm going to be looking in the components directory for card list, and every single style for the items and everything inside of that. You can see here, it's all the BEM naming and stuff. You can still see that it's all encapsulated and it's all going to be in that same file. It kind of tells you where to go. So it's not only maintainable and scalable, it's also helpful for debugging and for other people that maybe didn't build the project to come in and debug and make modifications and upgrades in the future. So like I said, if you want to get more into it, that's how you do it. But the last thing I want to go over is modifiers. So typically when you have menus and you got your elements inside of those, you could have variations of those elements. You could have like a button large, button small. And so typically how you would denote a modifier is with 2 hyphens and then whatever you want to call it. So let's say you had, this is just one example. So you've got a title, and what we're using here is title important to give it, emphasis. So you could have a title not important to kind of gray something out. You can make up whatever you want to. This is just an example of a modifier, and I'll show you how we handle that in the styles once we get into the SCSS. All right, I'm not seeing anything, so I will assume I did well enough at explaining it. And we're gonna go on. So I'm going to go ahead and close the inspector. So this is what we're building. Let me rephrase this. We're not building this, it's already built. The styles are built. We're gonna refactor that. So I did misspeak earlier. It's already built. If you wanna build it on your own, feel free. It's honestly rather easy. It didn't take me very long, and it's not very long of a style sheet, so go for it. But it is already built. We're not going to build it from scratch. It's already built. So we have these nice little animations. It's just some cards. It is responsive. Let me make this where I can actually resize it. So it is responsive to a point. It's not perfect, but it gets smaller and scales, or not scales, whatever you want to call it. And then this here isn't really a practical example. I don't know what you'd build like this, but I mean, there are some cool examples if you look into like blog posts and stuff about for loops, but this is what we're going to use for an example for a for loop for SCSS. So if you go to front end study on GitHub, you can go to your forked one or mine, doesn't matter. If you look down here, you'll see tools required. Click this Koala link, and then go ahead and download this. It works on Linux, Windows, and Mac. I don't think it's a big download. Shouldn't take you very long. It's very simple to use as well. I'm gonna go over it, but download that, and that's what we're gonna use to compile the SCSS to normal CSS, because that is what we use. And this is what it looks like. I'm on the Windows tonight. Typically I do this on the MacBook, but tonight I decided everything's hooked up to my desktop, so we're just gonna do it on here, but it's really no difference. I've got everything pretty much similar. So with Koala, I'm not gonna get into Koala yet. So I'm gonna show you what we kind of have. I'm hoping that you all kind of looked at the starter files. If not, it's not a huge deal, it's fine. So I've already built out everything you see. We're using some pseudo selectors here for Untitled type to do the green backgrounds that you see here. Here are the styles for the card list. It's not a lot. Really, it's not a ton. And this is normal CSS. This is not SCSS. So in the starter files, which I'm going to copy and paste like you guys will typically do when you start working on this as well. So this is normal CSS. We're going to copy and paste, and then we're going to change it to an SCSS file and kind of implement the features that SCSS gives us. So we got our card list stuff, all the styles. You can see here, all of the styles. It's just I'm using the same class names. It's going to be a lot easier in SCSS using nesting. You'll see that here soon. So that's pretty much what we got. If you did look over it, you may understand. I mean, it's not much. It's just Flexbox and a few other things, so it's not too crazy. And then the Untitled type selectors. So if you look over it now, if you haven't looked over it yet, what we're gonna do. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So if I wanted to go ahead and start this, so this is what you guys are gonna do whenever you get Koala downloaded and all that. If you already have it downloaded, this is what you do right now if you want to. So I'm going to copy starter files. I'm going to paste them. You should be renaming this to whatever your GitHub username is. And now I'll close this. I don't need what I did here. So close this. So now I have my own folder and the indexed HTML file. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep the link to styles CSS the same, but we're going to change the name of this to styles.scss. And so temporarily, if you so we have to change the URL as well. So you have to manually go to the URL of your username because I don't have a link to that. And when you do it, assuming that you just changed the file name of the style sheet, it's going to break the styles. So it looks broken. So what we have to do is now I would use Koala. Also, so I'm just going to go through this. Let me know, like put in the chat if I'm going too fast or if you missed something, I'll go back and look and go over it. But I'm just going to keep trying to go through this because I don't know if this is going to take like a full 2 hours or not. So I want to kind of get through everything. So what I did is I changed this to an SCSS file. Now what I need to do is go into Koala and select that folder so that we can compile it. So go to Activities, SCSS and BEM. I'm ironclad, styles, and then what you're going to do with Koala, you're not going to select the style sheet. You're going to select the folder that the style sheet is in. Typically, it comes, so all you're going to do is you're going to select the folder. If you want to, right off the bat, what you can do is rename this to SCSS and BEM, or SCSS BEM. Yeah, I'm just going to call it SCSS and BEM just so I know which activity it's for. So it comes, you click on the file name and it gives you this little toolbar. It comes with its own kind of options with source map. I typically take source map off just because I don't need it right now. And this is just for learning purposes. However, I do put auto prefix, and then for the output style, I change to compressed. So I know you guys that are just downloading this and maybe people that haven't gotten this yet, you're not going to know what I just did. Once you get to this point, let me know what you need to see again and I'll go ahead and show you. But for now, you would just hit compile and you have auto compile checked. So all you got to do is minimize this. And any time that we change this, it's going to compile to this style sheet. And to prove that, we can delete and also you'll see that the style sheet's back. So if we refreshed it, everything's back to normal. And to prove that it's compiling automatically, we can delete this file and save. And there's our style sheet. It just came back. So that proves that the compiler is working. So you don't have to worry about it. You can minimize it. Just don't close it. I don't know if it works closed. I'll just keep it minimized. Let's see. We got variables, nesting, mixins, for loops. We're not going to go over while loops or each loops in SCSS. I feel like those are more specific cases and they're more advanced anyways. So that's something that you can get into after you get into the basics. So you have for loops and then extending styles and then architecture partials. It's officially called partials by SCSS, but it has to do with architecture, so I kind of leave that in there. So these are the things that SCSS gives us, the features. Variables, you might be familiar with now we have actual CSS variables. I think that just came into play last year, honestly, with decent support. And so it's growing popularity. However, I use SCSS anyways, so I just stick to SCSS variables. It's the same thing. They can hold strings, pixel values. Let me phrase that. It's not quite the same thing. The syntax is a little different, and I haven't used CSS variables, so I'm not 100% sure that they do like strings and pixel values and all that stuff. They might. You guys might know if you've used them, but I just stick to SCSS variables. And they take string, pixel values, percentages, EMs, whatever it is. The next thing is nesting. So the big benefit here for nesting from SCSS. So for instance, you see here how in normal CSS we can't, you essentially have to do loop blocks, and then you have to have a whole entire another block with loop blocks block. And that just gets redundant to type. And so a big thing with nesting, so this is already an SCSS file, so I'm gonna go ahead and actually do this for you. So a big thing with nesting is we use the ampersand, and that essentially captures whatever class name that we have so far in this block. So this is essentially the same thing as saying loop blocks. That's the same thing as saying loop blocks. And you can you can concatenate technically anything you want to, but essentially what this is useful for, if you're using BEM naming methodology, I can now just do loop blocks block. And then I'm just going to copy and paste these styles. Like, it's fine if you copy and paste. You can type it in though if you want to. That'll kind of give you the feel of actually building the site. But since I've already built it and I'm just kind of teaching you guys, I'm just going to copy paste. So now, instead of having to have this entire separate block, all I have to do is use the ampersand underscore underscore block, which is, you know, the class name. And then I get the same exact classes. And I want to say, you can see here on the screen, if you have VS Code, I don't know if any other editors do this, you can actually see that if you hover over the class name, I'm pointing to the screen, you guys can't see that. So if you actually hover over the thing, it'll show you the element or the class, the full class that it comes out to. So you can see that it's just selecting loop blocks block. So if you're ever curious or you want to make sure that that's how it is, if you have VS Code, and this might be a package I have, I honestly can't tell you. I got a few extensions, so it might be an extension to VS Code, but either way, there is something with VS Code that allows you to see this as you hover it, and so that's helpful for knowing that you got the right selector. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this commented code because we no longer need it, just to show you that everything's still working. This has to do with the green blocks, and so we're going to make sure that they are still the same. And I refresh the page, and they are still the same. So that style is still working. We just nested it. That's nesting. Now the next feature is mixins. They're essentially functions. They're pretty much like functions in SCSS. You pretty much set up, it's literally a function. You have parameters if you want them. You don't have to have them. They can have default values as well. And it essentially puts out any code that you want to have. Another thing that I forgot is if-else conditionals. SCSS also does if-else conditionals. You'll also use these a lot in your mixins according to the variables. So you'll say if, you know, this variable is this, then do that, yada, yada, yada. And so these work together really well. So mixins are functions that you can reuse code. Their main purpose is to reuse code. So let's say that a good example, I'm actually going to show you this in the example code just because it's a perfect example and it's a very simple one. So if you look here, you can see that I have a mixin called margin middle, and all it does is set the margin right and left to auto. So any block, any element that I want to be centered horizontally, all I have to do is include that mixin, and it does these styles wherever I include it. And so now if I wanted to change how I, margin middle something, I don't have to go and change that every single spot that I, essentially put the code. I can just come to this one mixin, change it, and that will reflect everywhere across the project. If-else conditionals, those are self-explanatory. If-else, for loops. So SCSS gives us for loops. They give us a few loops. They give us for loops, while loops, and they give us each loops. So kind of like a PHP for loop or an array for each. So that it gives us that as well, but those are, like I said earlier, those are kind of more specific to the project or the use case, and I don't really have any good examples to show you with those, so all we're going over is for loops, which I did have a good example for. So it's self-explanatory again, just a loop in SCSS. Extending styles, this is kind of similar to mixins, but a lot more basic. It essentially allows you to, you essentially, let's say you have a style, we're gonna go here in content. So let's say you wanted to extend some styles, you would do this, and then you would give it a class name of whatever you wanted to extend. So a good place that I could do this, let's say that I had, I'm not going to do the code, but to show you visually, let's say that I had these cards. Let's say that I wanted a card large. I could then have a class name called card large, and then all I have to do for the majority of these basic styles is extend the basic cards. Let's say we're in the card list and I have card list item, and then that item has a modifier of large. What I could do is then extend card list. So that right there, and that'll give me all of these styles at the card. I'm sorry, I would extend card list item, not the list itself, but each item. And so assuming it should also be below this, I'm just showing you for purposes right now. So it would actually give it all of these styles, and then you would just override or add anything else you want here. So you could change the height and width if you wanted, pretty much. And so that's what extending does. It allows you to pretty much copy the styles from another selector without actually copying and pasting them. So that's very nice and useful for whenever you have variations of components. And then the very last thing is partials and architecture. So it's a very small file that we have, but I do believe it at least lends itself to a few, like breaking it out into a few different files. So what we're going to show you is how to use SCSS partials, which essentially just means it's its own like component style sheet. It's not in the main style sheet. It's got its own component style sheet. That's all that kind of means. And what those do, that helps with the architecture, which makes the whole thing more scalable and maintainable, makes the styles much cleaner. It's technically in one style sheet when it's all compiled, but you're developing in multiple style sheets, and it's all clean and easy to understand where things are. So with that being said, we are going to get into it. Variables. So what we want to do with variables, the idea of variables, why they're very valuable, is imagine we have a huge project. Imagine we have 100 components, and they all use, and let's say their main container, all of them have the same basic container styles. Well, that would be more of a Mixin example. So let's say all of their container styles, the width was 1,000 pixels. Let's say all the containers were 1,000 pixels. If you wanted to update those in the future, if you didn't have those in a variable, you'd have to go to all 100 of those component files or all of those styles, whatever kind of file sheet structure it's in. You'd have to go to all 100 of those places and change it and make sure it's the same. Whereas if I were to use a variable, so a variable in SCSS is declared using the $sign and then whatever you want. So we're going to say class name, and then you also put a semicolon. It's not an equal sign, it's a semicolon. So class name equals, we could say content. So if I've got a variable name, or you know what, we were talking about width, so let's do it and make it a little more sense. So we have width, and it can be an actual pixel value instead of a string. So if I had this variable and use that variable in all 100 style sheets, instead of having to go through all those 100 style sheets and change that, all I'd have to do is change this to 900 pixels, and then all of the other styles will follow suit. So that's the power of variables. So what you want to do is whenever you typically, I want to kind of get you guys in the mindset of going back and refactoring stuff that you've already built into SCSS as much as you can and build up as you go. So what you want to do is whenever you've already built something in CSS, you want to go back and you want to identify the variable, like not the variables, the spots where you're using kind of like the same values. So for instance, if I'm using, I know in this project I'm using 15 pixels in a few places, I know that it would be more valuable for me to make a variable called spacing or whatever I want to call it, and then refer to that variable instead. And this is very small scale. This is one style sheet, so it's not a big deal, but it's to get you in the mindset and habit of doing it for these bigger projects. So what we're going to do, I don't have a width variable that I'm going to set. We're going to go through right now and identify what I can change or turn into a variable. So right off the bat, I see two 100 pixels here. So I'm going to make sure, I'm probably going to make a variable for that no matter what now, but I want to see if it's anywhere else as well. So 100 pixels, there it is again, and 100 pixels. Let's see, I think that might be it. Okay, so that's all. This is the end of the file. So I have 3 locations with 100 pixels. So what I can do instead, typically whenever we're dealing with spacing or margins, whatever you want to call it, I'll give it a variable name of something like spacing. You can call it padding, margin, whatever, and then I'll give it a descriptor like small, medium, large, or whatever. So this is 100 pixels, so we'll consider it large. And then we say spacing large is 100 pixels. Now what we do is select these things. If you're not familiar with how to select all of them, so essentially if you're on a Windows, you can hit Control-D. If you're on a MacBook, you can hit Command-D. I believe that's the hotkey it should be, and that'll select the next instance of whatever you're highlighted right now. So if you notice, I'm hovering just this 100 pixels or highlighting just this 100 pixels. Hit Command-D, and now it's highlighting this one as well. Hit it one more time, and now it's highlighting this one. So I can type once and change that to spacing large, and it just changed it to every single one. So you can see that I'm typing in multiple spots. So that's what Command-D does for you. So for instance, if I wanted to change everything that's 100%, I could select 100% and then hit Command-D a few times. You could do it until it stops moving the file around, and then I could change that to 90% if I wanted to. That's just a little shortcut for you. So we're going to change that to spacing large, and then identify something else that we can change to a variable. I haven't seen anything else up here. I'm not going to bother with 0. There's no need to make 0 a variable. Just leave it as 0. 100% I feel like is the same thing as 0. It's the opposite side of the spectrum. I don't think there's unless you have like a specific container or something that needs, I don't know. If you decide to do a width for 100%, do it. There's no right or wrong. I'm just choosing not to do one. I still haven't seen anything up here that is identifiable or similar, sorry. Let's see, variables. Let's see, we got a lot of pixel values here, 10 pixels. So we do have 10 pixels here twice. I'm not sure if it's anywhere else though. So I don't see 10 pixels anymore. So because we have 2 of them, you can make a variable if you want to, but for now I'm not going to worry about it just because it's 2 instances. I typically do like 3 or more, whatever. You can make your own standard. It's up to you. There's no standard set already. So again, let's see, 15. I think I did identify. Yep, there's another 15 here, and I think I used 15 down here quite a bit as well. So 15 can definitely be a variable. I think it's referenced like probably 5 to 10 times. So instead of large, we're going to go to small, and then we're going to make that 15 pixels. So now what we do, one thing to be careful for, I'm going to go ahead and do this for you guys just because this could be a gotcha in a style sheet. So let's say that you're down on the bottom and you have, where's 15 pixels? So say you have 15 pixels selected and you do the Command D trick or Control D trick to select all the 15 pixels and your variables in the same style sheet, be careful because it's going to select that as well. So when you start changing that to spacing small, that's going to change that as well. So you'd have to go back here to the top and then change this back to 15 pixels. So just watch out for that whenever you're doing the Command or Control D trick. So now I did actually just change all of those to command or spacing small and then changed it back. So these are spacing small now. So if I ever want to change the spacing of this, I can just go back to that one variable and not have to go through all of these styles to get back to it. Next thing, I'm going through more variables. I see font size 20 here. I'm not sure if 20 is used anywhere else. I'm going to see real quick. So 20 is used here, so that's the 3rd occurrence. So I'd probably make one for that as well. 20, that's 20%, not pixels. So there's 3 occurrences. We're gonna go ahead and make a variable for it, and we'll call it spacing medium. And so you make this up as you go, as the project demands it. You create whatever variables you want. If you want regular instead of medium, it's up to you. It's kind of whatever makes sense to you, but try to make it where it actually, makes sense. Or if someone else was coming into this project, they wouldn't have to guess what your variable name is. It's obvious right off the bat. So we're going to make this one spacing medium, and it's going to be 20 pixels, and we're going to go straight down here, and we're going to command Control D all these again. I think I've selected that one. I did. So we're going to go spacing medium. I need to be careful because I changed the variable. So this needs to be 20 pixels. Go ahead and save that. So I'm going to see if there's anything else. 35 pixels. I'll see that right off the bat. There's another one here. 35. Is there another one? Nope, there's no more. So there's only 2 occurrences of that. So I'm not going to worry about that either because there's only 2, I think. Let me double check. 35. Okay, so I don't see any more 35. So these are the variables that we're going to use for spacing. Now so we're going to typically in a style sheet, you would have comments and just, let yourself know what's going on. So these are spacing variables, or you can call them, if you wanted to, you can call them layout variables, whatever you want to call them. The next thing that you're typically going to make variables for is, I don't want that full thing. The next thing you're going to be making variables for is colors. So let's go ahead and go through and identify colors. So this here, if you're unfamiliar, raise your hand if you're unfamiliar with RGB or RGBA. I would hope that you are not, but we'll see. It's very simple. So if you're unfamiliar with it, essentially it's red, green, blue, and alpha, which are the color channels. So if you wanted to create a green, which is what we're doing here, this is the green that we're creating, you would just do 0 and then the number, and then 0, and then the alpha channel would be 1 for 100%. However, I think I changed this earlier today. in my own, we don't actually want the alpha channel just because it doesn't really matter. So we're going to delete that and delete that, and then select all of these RGBAs and then take off the A so it doesn't break. So now we're just doing RGB because all we need is the color. It's not the alpha is not very important. So anyways, colors, we're not going to make variables for these colors just because they change, and so there's not really a point to. I'll kind of show you how we solve this later on. It's a little bit different. So we're going to continue down. I think there are a few more colors down here that we can make. Yeah, here we go. So we got 333 and green. So those are pretty much our two colors. So we're going to make variables for those. And these, you can name whatever you want to. You can do, excuse me, Byron, your hand's raised. Do you have a question? What's up? What you got? And thanks for using the feature. It's actually really useful. One of them was 260. Yes. Does it only go to 24, if not 255? You're right. It might be. It very well might be. However, I think if you do 260, I think it just defaults to 255, the max. But I think you might be right. Let's check it out. I'm going to check it out right now. I think I got a good, not the contrast, color picker. 255. Yeah, so you see here an RGBA color, RGB. I think that's, yeah. Yep, 255 is the max. So if you do 260, it just defaults to it. I think I just did 260 because of 20s. So I just went for like, you know, increments is all I went for. It'll default to the max. So what I probably could have done was 250, 30, 10, 190, etc. Anywho, thanks for pointing that out. It's a good catch. Don't want to mislead any of y'all. So what we're doing, colors, colors, colors. So you can name these whatever you want. I'm going to be very, very simple. We have color blue, not blue, sorry, it's a gray, which is 333. And that is a hexadecimal number, if you're unfamiliar with that. And this is color green, which we're just going to make the actual color green. It's nothing special. So now what we're going to do down here is change this to color gray and this to color green. And now we can add those colors anywhere else we want. And if we ever want to change the colors, all we have to do is change them in this one spot as opposed to all these other spots. The next type of variables that we're going to typically create are going to be, let's see, layout, color, and font variables. Well, I don't know if I used this in my actual example. I'm going to see what I used real quick. I don't think I actually used font. I think it was spacing. Okay, so it was just Mixins. So I actually didn't use any more. So typically I'm not going to create these, but I'm just going to show you typically what you would do. Let's say you had a specific font family. You would create a variable. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. You would create a variable called font default if you want to. And then let's just, for instance, say I wanted to use Helvetica, Arial, or sans serif. And so now anywhere that you wanted to call that font family, you would just include, or not include, you would just call this variable, and that'll give you that font default. And if you wanted a variation, you could say font italic pretty much. And then let's say you had an italic variation, you would call that as well. So I'm not going to leave these in here because we don't have no use for them. But you know, you would typically create variables for fonts and other things as well. So that's all we're going to do for variables for now. So I'm going to actually get rid of this. So now we have nesting. I'm wondering if I should give you the for loop example just because I could use it and then nest the for loop example. No, we're going to do for loop later. We'll do for loop later. It's a little more advanced, so we're just going to nest this as is. So what we're going to do is we're going to go straight down the style sheet and we're going to start nesting everything that we have. So for instance, this right here, I said to ignore this. I mean, it's a little bit of reset. You should be able to tell what it's doing. It's just getting rid of margin paddings, a little bit of letter spacing that I set somewhere else, and then box sizing border box. Not a big deal, but you can see that it's a child of content. So what we can do is we can nest this. What we can say is the ampersand. So ampersand, don't forget the ampersand is what captures where you are currently. And then you would pretty much just do the selector as normal. And it's giving me a squiggly here just because it's empty. So if I put anything in it, it's gonna be quiet. So now it's fine. So it was just telling me you can't use an empty block. So now we can copy, yeah, I think this is where we cut it from. So we can cut this and paste it right in there. Oops. So some of my hotkeys and stuff are wonky because I'm on the Windows tonight. So now we can get rid of this. We can copy or cut this comment and put that down here. And get rid of this. I don't know if we're going to be able to visually see if anything's the same or different. Looks like everything is the same. So yeah, that's a nested thing that we had there before. Loop blocks, we kind of already did this. Here's what we're going to get into, some more advanced nesting with the for loop. So you'll see some more advanced stuff. We're going to go ahead and nest this now. So we have our loop blocks and we have our blocks. So you can nest as deep as you want to. Some people, so you can deepest nest as you want to. It's up to you. Some people, some developers, senior devs, whatever, they might have a preference that you only go like a certain level deep, because then it kind of gets to be an incredibly long class name and you can kind of break back out of it and do BEM all over again. So, excuse me. So it's whatever you want to do, but depending on where you work or whatever, you might have a standard to follow. So what you can do with block now is if I wanted to, I can go in here and I could nest inside of block. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So you can see we have our class, which is loop blocks block, which is the same thing that we have here. As you can see, as I'm hovering. So all we want to do is take the unth of type. Oh, I have it selected. Here we go. So we want to take the unth of type and we actually want to put that right on that ampersand and then fix the spacing. There we go. So that is saying, here, you can see exactly what it's saying. It says loop blocks block unth of type. So that shows you that it's actually working. So you can get rid of this now. We can do the same thing here. So all you gotta do is add another ampersand and then paste. And then hit tab twice. And then this is gonna be a little bit of copy paste, so bear with me. But you kind of get the idea, I hope. Let me know if this is not clear, if you don't get this. I'll try to find another way to explain it. Seems like everyone might be getting it. So we're gonna just keep cutting. We're just gonna make another ampersand. So we're pretty much making the same exact styles, just nested. Then we can get rid of this, that's unneeded. Get that space back. Excuse me. So this is the exact same thing, and to prove it, we can go here and refresh, and everything is still the same. So, ta-da! So now that's nested, and that's nesting. You could, so pseudo selectors, same thing with hover and all that other stuff. So if I wanted a hover effect, which I do have that we'll get to later, you would do the same thing, an ampersand, and then you would just do hover. So we could say width 1000. I'm just putting something so it doesn't give me that green squiggly. So now if you look at the selector, you can see it's loop blocks block on the hover pseudo selector. And so that's how you would nest pseudo selectors and all of this kind of thing. So that's nested. Now we are done with the loop blocks. Now we're on to the card list. This is the bigger component, so this is going to be the more advanced stuff as well. I'm wondering, can you guys see this right now well? Because if you can see this well, I'm going to leave it at this size so that you can see more of the code and what we're doing instead of it being so big. Yeah, give me a check if you can see it well enough. I'm seeing a few, so I think it's okay. There we go. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. All right, cool. So I'm gonna leave it in this view so we can see more of what's going on, have more real estate. So one of the benefits, before we go into the card list, I just want to speak about the benefits of what we're doing. So it goes back to kind of the clashing of component styles that I mentioned earlier, and the encapsulation, or what you can, I don't think this is a word, but I call it componentization of these styles and elements and everything. So whenever we nest, it's going to give us the same CSS we would have written, but we know that the styles that we're writing here all belong to loop blocks and they don't belong to anything else. So if a element does not have this class name on it, none of this is going to apply to it. And we know that because it's nested. It's the same thing in normal CSS. It's just much more visually easy to understand in SCSS. It's all about, SCSS was invented all to make the development experience better. And so that's what it's about, is to make it better. You can do the same thing in CSS. It's just this makes it easier, more readable, and just, in my opinion, all around nicer. And so that's the benefit of what we're doing here. So now we're going to keep going into card list. And here is the benefit, like I think I already said it, that the benefit of using BEM is now I can just do card item or card list ampersand and then item, and then I can just copy and paste these styles. So if you're ever refactoring something, you can, I mean, if you wanted to retype it, you could, but you can just copy and paste, and essentially, you know, you're still going to get the idea of what's happening here with the nesting and whatnot. So now item is done. So let's just make sure. And that refers to these things down here. So I'm just making sure that these aren't changed and they seem to still be fine. At any point, sorry, raise your hand if you have a question so far. So let me know if you do have a question. So we've done the item. All those styles are working fine. So now we're going to nest media queries. Media queries are, and they're not kind of different. You'll kind of see how we do it. So essentially we have our item, and this is a style that, so I'm trying to think of how to explain it. So in CSS, you have the media query, and then you have your class name inside of that media query. That's not necessary in SCSS, because since you're nesting, it kind of knows what you're doing. And so what you can do, or it might be in normal CSS too, but it's a different kind of way that I write it in SCSS. So essentially what we're doing, we want to select an item, and we want to select that item on hover. So let's start out with the basics. We know we want to select the item on hover, so let's create that pseudo selector. And now we know that we want that hover to be in a media query. So like I said, the class name is inside of the media query. It's a little different here. So you can do this and say, well, you know, I think there's multiple ways to do it. I'm going to see if this works, and then I actually might do it another way too. Medial screen and width, 768 pixels. And then copy and paste. So I'm going to save this. Let's see if this works. Actually, I think I need to take this out to make sure that it works. All right. Okay, so it broke, and it did break, and I was wrong. Are we supposed to be inside the item block? You are correct. Yes, you are. Thank you. And I also think there's another issue too, but that is definitely an issue. So thanks for pointing that out. So let's see if that should give us this here. So, okay, so actually the hover did come back. So I thought I had another issue. Okay, so like I said, the media query works without you having the class names in here, just because you're nested inside of this hover. You could write it like this. I'm gonna comment this out for now. You could also just do the media query inside of the item block. So let's do media only, screen, min width. And now we could say hover, and now we could do the same styles there too. So this might be a little bit of a cleaner, more understandable way. And this, honestly, I think this might be the way that I typically do it, but you can do it like this as well. So you would typically do the media query, and then you would just do the ampersand, which captures, again, it captures that class name, as you can see there, card list item hover. And so that's how you kind of do media queries with nesting. Let me know if I was unclear on anything on that. Let me know if that's still something you need to understand a little more. I'll try to go over that again. And I'm gonna keep, go ahead, and while we're doing this, I'm gonna go ahead and nest these other ones as well. So we're gonna have the same thing. This is just a different media query. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this line. So we would say, oops, I hit Control B, I didn't mean to do that. So there's the media query. And then I'm going to take, so we see that we're just selecting card list item, not on the hover. So all we actually need is the ampersand. So I'm just going to copy the actual block, not the class name itself. So we have the ampersand, and then just paste the block that we had. There we go. I think there's an extra space there. There we go. So now this should be able to remove. Also, this comment, I need to move this back. So this comment is related to this media query. We only want the hover effect. I'll go over this real quick. So we only want the hover effect to happen on the desktop or larger devices. And the reason we do that, so this hover effect is what I'm talking about. with the box shadow and the translation or the changing of the size. And the reason we want to avoid that on mobile is because it gets kind of, I don't know if you've ever used a hover effect on mobile, but it gets kind of janky. So it's gone here. So you can see it's just a box shadow. It gets kind of janky on mobile, and like whenever you click, the click counts as a hover. And so yeah, I don't use it for the mobile. Chad, did you mean to unmute? Just making sure. Okay, there we go. All right, so back media queries. There we go. So last media query to do. This is I'm just gonna copy and paste this, put it below this media query, and then you can kind of see how I've got max with 1,000, max with 750. You can do whichever order you want to. If you want the smaller number to come before, you can do that, or you can do 750 below. It doesn't matter. That's your preference. So now in here, all we need to do, we're just selecting the card list item again, and then we're going to give it a width. So ampersand and then width. So this ampersand is capturing this item, and it's a media query for that. Does that make sense? Does this code block not make sense to anyone? Let's continue with the nesting then. I think this is what we just nested, so we don't need this anymore. Let me get rid of that excess space. One thing to be careful for, I notice with a lot of guys that are, or I say guys, a lot of people that are new to the industry, styles might be like messy and all over the place. Like be really conscious of, like, try to write clean styles. And so for instance, don't have like 3 spaces here, 4 spaces there. Try to be consistent. If you want 2 spaces, do 2 spaces, but do 2 spaces everywhere and be consistent with it. And so that's just a tip I have for cleanliness and consistency. On to nesting. So we have our card list item, and inside of our item we have a few more elements. We have a figure. Inside that figure we have an image, and then back inside of the item itself we have a title and a body. This we're using the same kind of we're using a comma delimited selector, simple stuff, just CSS. And then we have also a title with a modifier of important. And then we have card list item body, which is just another thing in the item itself. So for card list item fig, so remember the ampersand is going to capture everything that we have so far. So if you wanted to, you could just change what you know you're going to put into it, or you can just delete the class name that you know you're already going to capture, cut it directly, and then in VS Code, if you have the bracket highlights, it'll show you with the purple here which bracket I'm in case you're in a really big code block. It's really nice to kind of know where you are. You can see with the media queries here. And so I'm going to go right below this media query, which is inside of the item, and place fig. And so now if we look here, we say the selector is card list item fig. So that's nested, very simple. Next, we have something inside of the fig. So the same thing, we know we're going to capture everything up to the fig. Just change that to an ampersand, cut it, and then we can change that and paste it right in here. Now we have fig and then card list item fig image. So those are the same styles. I'm going to move these comments up here as well. If you have already looked at this code, you might have seen this comment. Essentially what's going on, I'll actually show you guys here now since you're with me. I'm going to change this to 100%. It might not happen on Windows. It was happening on my MacBook earlier. So it doesn't seem to be happening right now. But earlier when I hovered, there was like a really thin white line over here on the edge of the image, and I really didn't know what was causing it. And so one way to assuredly fix that is to make the image a tiny bit bigger than the actual container. So we just use 101%. Simple as that, and I explained that here. So that's now nested. Get rid of this excess space. Now we have item title and item body. So we're going to be all the way in item already. So I'm just going to use Control D to select both of those at the same time and change both of them to an ampersand. We're going to cut those. We're going to make sure we're not in figure. We want to be in this purple block here. So then we would paste right there. So now our selector is card list item title, card list item body. Now we have the title itself alone. Same thing. As you can see, it's really, whenever you're refactoring, it's really repetitive, but this is gonna like drill it into your brain how to nest and whatnot. So I hope this is a good exercise for you guys. Whenever you do it on your own, you should do it on your own. I'm watching you. So now our title's nested. I'm not really watching you, by the way. So here is something else that we're gonna teach you kind of two things at once here. So this is a good example of not only using nesting, but we're going to show you how to use the extension of styles. Yeah. So we have a modifier that has, if you look at it closely, I'm just gonna go ahead and copy most of this. I'm gonna cut this, and then let's say we have ampersand. So that is saying, give me a sec, let me fix the spacing. So this selector is card list item title modifier important. If you look here, you can see letter spacing, padding, font size, and font weight are all the exact same as here. And the reason we do that is because now that we have like this class name that you see here with that modifier attached to it isn't going to get the same styles as this because there's no modifier attached to it. So it's technically a different class name. So what we can do to capture those styles without having to rewrite everything is we can extend the class name. And you can't do the ampersand here. I actually tried this earlier for the first time. You can't do the ampersand, but an easy way to do it if you have this little hover effect here is you can just refer to that and then say you add the extend and then you do the class name. So I would do card list item and then title, I believe. So one more and then title. So now that I've extended that, it's going to get all of these styles and I don't have to change anything about it. Or I don't have to add those here. If I do want to change these, they'll take effect here. And then essentially with the modifier, this is what's actually being modified, it's the color. And that's why it's called a modifier. It changes one or like a few small things about a particular element or block, if you will. So that's how you would nest a modifier. You just extend that class name and it gets everything that you have for it. I'm going to delete this, get rid of this empty space, and now we're down to our last little code block, which is the item body. So one last time, let's delete that stuff and create an ampersand, cut it, I was trying to say cut it and cut this at the same time. I don't even know what I said. So we're in the right block. I'm going to add spacing there so I'm consistent, and then fix that spacing as well. So what I'm going to do now is refresh the page, and as long as everything is working fine, then I'll assume everything works. And it looks like it works fine, so I think everything's good to go. So that's nesting in general. And then also, that's my one example I've got for you for extending styles. But if you wanted to, whenever you do this project on your own, if you want to go a little bit further, Katie, do you have a question? You have your hands up. Let me know if you have a question. I just noticed that, sorry. Okay, you took your hand down, so I'm assuming not. Okay, so if you wanted to play around with it in your own, like whenever you do it, just make different titles. You can have title like warning, you can make it red, you can do title big, title small, whatever you want to do. Make as many modifiers as you want to. Just use this as an example. So that's all the nesting we can do. Everything's now nested. In my opinion, this is more easy to understand style sheet now. Just because I know loop blocks, this block, I can look here and see this yellow and know, I can scroll up and down and know that I'm in the loop block selector. I like it. So card list, I know that the item is with the card list. I know these media queries are only pertaining to this item. They're not media queries that have a bunch of stuff. I have been asked before. I just noticed that spacing was messed up, so I'm gonna fix that. That right there was messed up as well. It's always good to go back over your styles and make sure that what you want to be consistent on is actually done, because I didn't know that spacing was messed up. I have been asked before, why do I write so many media queries? Because for instance, if I had, let's say that my card list, let's say my card list had a media query for something, I would write another media query right here as opposed to having, even if it was the same dimensions as this here, I would write another one for it as opposed to having a media query at the top and then putting everything inside of it, just because I like knowing that this media query is specific to this selector. The argument that people would make is that it adds, bytes to a file. It's just more text to the file. If it was a huge project, yeah, that would make a difference. But in my mind, I think this is more understandable. And so this is my preference. And again, none of this stuff is, Some of it might be, but like most of this stuff is just all my opinion. You can do whatever you want to with it, have your own kind of spin on it, just kind of build off of one thing and form your own opinion on how to use it. So there are some things that standards are set on, but not everything. And then there's more spacing apparently messed up that I just saw. I think that's all the spacing. So we got nesting done. So typically I would do if-else conditionals before mixins, but they kind of go hand in hand. So I'm just going to use them at the same time. So we're going to create a mixin that we're going to create one that eventually uses if-else conditionals. Mixins are made for the same purpose that functions in JavaScript are made. They're made for reusability of code. What that means is, for instance, I told you earlier at the very beginning of the meeting of the group that, for instance, if I wanted a margin middle mixin, if I have a lot of containers that are doing margin right and margin left, or margin zero auto, whatever you want, however you want to do it, if I have a bunch of containers doing that, I see benefit in creating a container that I can include in all of those components and then just change it one place. So what we're going to do here is do mixins. We're going to get rid of that. So we're going to create a mixin. How you create a mixin, you use an an @ sign, and then mixin, and then give it whatever name you want to. So this one we're going to call it margin middle. It's just like a function, so you give it the parentheses and then curly braces. Excuse me. With SCSS, you can also pass parameters to these. Again, it's the same thing as other variables. It starts with a $sign and then anything you want to call it. So variable, and then you can also, I don't think you have to give it a default, but you can with the semicolon. So if I wanted this variable to default to hello, that's how I do it. However, for this particular mixin, I don't think we need any variables. So all this mixin is going to do is we're going to do margin right is auto, and margin left auto as well. Something that I've been asked before, Byron, do you have a question? If so, ask away. Mixins scoped. Well, so typically with mixins, I'm gonna show you how we break this out later on. I'll tell you about it now and show you later. You break it out into its own partial, into its own file. And what you do is you include that wherever you want to in your styles. And so essentially what it does, it's a function, but it's ultimately just going to print out the properties that you have in the mixin. So if I were to include this mixin here, if I included margin middle, all it's going to ultimately do is put margin right and left in this style sheet. So it's going to scope to this selector because that's where it technically is. So you kind of abstract them to their own utility file, if you will. And then wherever you include it is where it is scoped. It just gives you the properties that you have in that mixin wherever you call it. So now we have, also I was going to say, I've been asked before why I choose to do margin right and left auto as opposed to margin zero auto. The reason for that is this was at my former spot, my supervisor, whatever you want to call him. They explained it to me as, in the fight of specificity and like fighting over different styles that are already set within CSS and larger projects. Imagine that I set margin zero auto. What that does is it sets the margin top and bottom to 0 and the margin right and left. So what if later on I wanted to go in and change margin top and margin bottom, but it was being overwritten because that style that I had, 0 auto, was lower in the cascade and took over. I wouldn't know what's going on because I think it's, I should be fine. But essentially what it is I'm doing only right and left because that's all I need. And I don't want to set something that I have to fight over in the future. It's not always going to happen. It's not, it's just a safety precaution, if you will. So it's you do it in order to not fight over yourself in the future. So that's just my preference and it's how I've always done it. So for instance, you can see here, I use top right and auto instead of, 0 auto or spacing large auto. It's just preference. So you can do 0 autos, whatever you want. I honestly haven't I don't think I've run into any issues where I'm fighting with something like that. That's just how I was explained it. So really it's to each his own. If you want to do 0 auto, that's fine. But just at least you know about it now. So if you ever do run into an issue like that, you can maybe think, okay, well, am I actually setting what I don't think I'm setting somewhere else? And then you might be able to debug it a little better. So hopefully that wasn't too much rambling and that made sense. Excuse me. So back to mixins. Margin middle. So now we have this mixin. What we want to do is replace everywhere that we have this code with that mixin. So we have, okay, so we have 2 spots that it has it. I'm going to deselect it just because it actually selected that as well. So I want to select it and include margin middle. If you don't pass params, I'm pretty sure that it's okay if you don't do the parentheses. All you have to do is call the name. Let's verify that first. Yeah, so that seems to still work, so that's fine. However, if you want to pass parameters or whatever, you would still call or use the parentheses. And if you want to use the parentheses just to make sure and do it just in case, go for it. Another thing, standard that I've stuck to is calling all of the includes or mix-ins or anything like that at the top of the styles. Honestly, I mean, it's just we want to know what's being included at the get-go. And also if we include something, let's say we include margin middle, but maybe at some point we want the margin right to be a different variable. If we included the margin middle at the bottom and we did margin right up here, this is going to be, let's say we did margin right 10 pixels. This margin right is going to be overridden because this is lower in the cascade. So now we have margin middle, so that should be the same. So it's in the center still. Let's say if I take this style out, what happens? So that's what happens whenever we take the style out. So that kind of shows you that it's working. There we go, include margin middle. So there we go. So that's working. So let's go to this other spot that I saw. Excuse me. So here we have it as well. Include margin middle. And then I'm going to cut and paste it to the top. I think that's the only spot that I have it now. Yeah, I don't see margin anywhere else. So that makes sense good. Now I'm going to try to identify another area that I can use. I think that I already know which one it's going to be. Yeah, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a padding mixin. What we're going to use it for, essentially we're going to use it for padding on all sides, but the main use of it, as you can see here, we're doing padding right, bottom, left, yada, yada, yada. It'd be useful and nice to have a mixin that kind of handles all of our use cases for padding. So for instance, we create a mixin. We can just call it padding if we want to. And here we're going to actually use some variables. So with this function, you kind of want to think, okay, so, if I have a padding mixin and I want padding on a particular element, do I want it on all sides? Do I want it on just 2 sides? If I want it on just 2 sides, are they a predetermined 2 sides? Or, do I need to check which ones they are? So essentially what you're trying to say is, let's say that we want the ability to have the same padding on all the same sides, but also to have individual padding. So what we can do is we can say top, then we can do right, bottom, left. One thing to note about CSS is when it comes to styles regarding top, right, bottom, left, they're always going to be in that order, top, right, bottom, left. And so anywhere that you have to do with top, right, bottom, left, whether it's padding, top, right, bottom, left, margin, top, right, bottom, left, border, top, right, bottom, left, always try to stick to that consistency because it goes in the order that the styles should be or whatever. I don't know if or whatever was a good explanation, but top, right, bottom, left is how they kind of go. So I kind of keep that order to make sense with how it is. So that is if we want to have individual padding on each of the sides. We can also have a variable that says, I'm not going to spend too much time. So let's say we want uniform padding, or we could say we want padding on all sides. We could say all padding. Yeah, we'll just say all sides. That makes more sense. We'll say all sides. We have top, right, bottom, left, and all sides. Here's where we're also going to implement the if-else conditionals. So what we're going to do is inside of this mixin, we're going to check if the all sides parameter is not null. And if it's not null, all we're going to do is do padding. So let's say So with an if, it's the same thing as mixin. You use an @ sign if, and then you use your parentheses. We could say all sides. I believe that it I believe is not equal is like that in SCSS. So you can say if it's not null, then we can say padding is all sides. It's giving me some kind of error. Okay, so I think there's only one one equal sign in SCSS, not two. So if all sides does not equal null, all we're going to do is set the padding to all sides, and that'll set it to all 4 sides. However, if that variable is null, then what we want to do is do padding top, and that's going to be top. Padding right is going to be right. Padding bottom is going to be bottom. And padding left is going to be left. And now one of the issues that we might run into is if, what happens if, they're not set, what is it going to break if I do like a null to padding bottom? We can set defaults on all of these variables. And so what we can do is pretty much how you set the variables up here with the semicolon or colon, whichever one it is. You can do the same thing here. So you'd say null. So you want all of these to be null from the get-go. You could, well, actually, instead of null for these, we're just gonna do auto instead of null. And then however, so left also needs to be auto. However, all sides, this one should definitely be null because we're checking if it's null here. So if all sides is not null, then we're gonna do padding on all the sides. However, if it is null, we're just gonna set padding on each of the properties that are not null, that are actually given to us. And I'm pretty sure if they're set to auto to begin with, that it technically does nothing. So if right was set, then we'll use this in a minute, and so that's how we kind of do it. Also, if you want to be a little cleaner, I don't know if it's cleaner or not because my editor is so big, but let's say that I had another file over here. Sometimes that can get messy, as you can see right here. So one thing I like to do, which I kind of picked up from React or whatever, is in styles. What you can kind of do is take each of these and break them out on their own line, like this, and then break this down to its own line. And then I think that's how I did it. Yeah, but I accidentally got rid of that. There we go. So that's so you can like more easily tell what the variables are, and then you got the function. So that's just another way to do that. That's a little more. It might be more readable to you. It might not. So that's the way I would do it, though. So how are we going to implement this mixin is the next question. So for instance, I'm going to comment this out just so I can visually show you this. Let's just say that I had padding 15 pixels all around, or actually, I'm sorry, not 15 pixels, spacing small. Let's say that I wanted it all around. You're going to notice a difference here on the body. You see how it got a little more padding up top there? If I wanted to now include this mixin, give it the same spacing on all sides, what I would do is I would comment this out, and I would say padding is, actually, sorry, I wouldn't say padding. You just include the mixin. You don't say padding include. So you would include padding and then pass in, you would pass in the all sides, and you would give it whatever value you want. So for this instance, we're going to do spacing small, and you can pass variables in there as well. So it's powerful in that fashion. And now another thing I need to address is whenever you're using variables in these mixins, if you can just pass in values as long as you have each of these variables in there, or at least the first one or first two or whatever, but you can't just pass in all sides. You can't just pass in null and then know that you're talking about all sides. If you want to pass in a particular variable, you have to actually call that variable, or say that you're setting that variable and then set it to whatever you want. So if I just did this, if I removed that all variable and just did spacing small, I think that it's just going to give it a padding of top. I'm going to verify that that is correct. Okay, so that is correct. So the padding top is still there, but all the other padding is gone because I just passed a value. It assumes it's my first parameter. So in order to make that all sides, I'd have to set that. And so now it comes back. However, I don't want the top to have the padding that it does. So instead of all sides, we're going to do this. We're going to say right, bottom, and left is all spacing small. And so now we should be back to our original styles, which is this right here. I'm going to delete this because that was for example. So this right here, including this padding mix-in, is the same thing as using this. And again, that's not, you might be like, well, why would you do that for such a small example? It's about, imagine it being in a bigger example. It's all about being reusable and not having to copy paste this everywhere you want to put it. That's what it's for. Did you have a question, Stephanie? If not, your hand is raised, so go ahead and lower it if you don't have a question. You might be typing it though. How do you use the variables in multiple style sheets? Good question. It's a good question. I will remind me in a moment whenever we go over architecture, I will address that and show you how we do that. Is that the only question? If so, then we'll continue and we'll get to that soon. What else are we going over here? So that's our padding mix-in. That's the only mix-ins we're going to make for now because we're going to kind of move on to the for loops. So we have mix-ins, if-else, conditionals. All right, yeah, because we got to move on. So that's our padding mix-in. If you want to implement it, you can do that here. We can also do that here. So you see that we have padding, spacing, small. This is a perfect spot to do this. So we say padding. So, I'm sorry, I did the padding thing again. You don't do that. You just include it. Include padding, and then set all sides to spacing small. There we go. So that should be the same for title. Let's verify. Yep, that still works. Any more padding anywhere? Oh, hey, chill. Cat's going crazy. All right, that's everything that we can use that mix-in for. So I'm going to delete that. So for loops. And this is what we're going to go over. So essentially, this is usually more specific to the component you're building. I found I think this is a decent example to show you how it's done. But ultimately, when you have something, when you need to loop through something or manipulate something by a particular increment or something like that, you can use for loops, and they're pretty much the same as any other language, just a little bit syntactically different. And you use those right in line of wherever the styles you are. So what we're going to change, how we're going to utilize it, is we're going to change these nth of type selectors. We're going to use a for loop to make this much cleaner and more understandable. Well, let me rephrase that. It might not be as understandable right off the bat, but it is definitely more readable significantly. So you say for I from 1 through 8, and then that percentage, you're creating a variable inside of this loop. Same thing you can do in JavaScript. You create a variable in the loop that is a percentage of 1 and whatever the index is. You can add, you can concatenate these variables like index onto a class name. So for instance, if you have, let's say you have a list item or a list of items and they have item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you could do a for I from 1 through 5 and then do item and then use that right there and then select that. So that's the syntax of it. You can always just go to Google and look it up and just read away. I mean, that's how I learn. That's how I've been learning lately, is just Google what I need to know and find whatever resources I think are valuable and accurate. So how we're going to do this, what's the point of what we're doing? So how can I identify that this is a spot to use a for loop? I kind of see that the styles are almost exactly the same, but they increment by 1 here and then decrement by 20 here. That's an example of something that if it's a uniform kind of decrement or increment, we can definitely use a for loop for it. So how we're going to start this off, I'm just going to comment this out for now. So now they're going to be invisible because they're going to all be a background color of white technically. Okay, so yeah, so they're gone. So again, the for loops are nested just like everything else. So if we're in this block here, if we're in loop blocks block and we do a for loop, it's only going to affect the styles here. So I say for, we create a variable called I, and then we have 5 items. So we're going to say from 1 through 5. And then we open the block. So essentially what we're going to do, we know that we have this selector with nth of type and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how you would access that is you do the ampersand, and that again, that's just like everywhere else. It captures the class name of where you are. So ampersand, then you do your pseudo selector, of type, and then instead of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all we have to do is interpolate that variable for I, which is the index, and then open the block, and that's the same thing. Again, it's giving me that green squiggly because it's an empty block at the moment. However, all I would need to do is copy this and paste. So let's go over this again. So we have 5 items here. We're selecting them by of type and the selector, and then we're decrementing the RGB value by 20. We do a for I from 1 through 5, and so it's looping through, and it's going to print out these styles pretty much. And so it's saying for of type with 1, it's going to give it this background color. And since this isn't dynamic yet, it's going to go through all of these and give it the same background color. So as you can see, now they're all the same exact color because it goes through all of them and just sets each of them to background RGB 0260. And for this exact moment, well, no, we're going to keep it 260 for now. So that is close to what we're doing. That's halfway to where we want to be. Now we want to change this RGB value. What's up, Byron? You got a question? Yes, yes. Okay, so interpolation. Let me make sure real quick. Yes, it is necessary. You see it kind of is giving me an error here. I think that's necessary. Yeah, it's necessary. So what that is, so imagine using a template literal in JavaScript and how you interpolate the value using the money sign and then whatever the variable name is. This is interpolation in CSS, but it uses a hashtag or whatever you want to call it. So you would use a hashtag, and anywhere that you are using variables that's inside of like a for loop or an if statement, I'm pretty sure you have to interpolate it. There's some instances where you don't, but for this instance, you do. So if you ever run into an issue where it says variable is not, accessed, or it gives you an error regarding the variable, just make sure you have to interpolate it or don't have to interpolate it. So we interpolate the I value, and then now we want to make this value dynamic. So what we want to do in this for loop, I think there's multiple ways that we can do this, but in my mind, we want to just start off at a number and then decrement by a certain amount. So what we do is whenever we do the for loop, we create a, outside of the for, we don't want to create the variable inside the for loop because then it will get reset every loop. So outside of this for loop, we want to create a starting, we're going to call it starting point or starting, we're going to call it starting val, and then we're going to give it 255. We're going to do 255 now just because we called that earlier. So imagine that's 255. So we're going to say starting value is 255. What we want to do is whenever we call this in the for loop, we want to give each of these the starting value. But, so if I left it just like it is right now, all it's saying is this is going to be 255. We're going to get the same result. It's all going to be green, the same color. To change it, all we do is manipulate that variable just like in JavaScript. So we'd say starting val, you do the semicolon or colon just like you would normally, and you'd say it is now starting val minus 20. And so now when you hit that loop again, this is going to be 235. Hit it again, it's going to be 215, etc., etc. So I believe we should be good now. There we go. So that is how you kind of use a for loop, and it kind of goes through and increments or decrements something as you need it to. Is there anything that you don't understand about what's happening here? Raise your hand. And there are also while loops and each loops. We're not going to get into those just because it's almost time, and I want to go over architecture and all that stuff that we, the remaining questions we have. Feel free to explore that on your own, though. And like I said, I think those are more specific to the component or the, they're more specific to the component or the project, but feel free to play around and create whatever you want to. So that is the for loops. It seemed like everybody understood that. So we're now going to get into architecture. We're going to revisit Stephanie's question. How do we use these variables in multiple style sheets? And that has to do with creating the architecture for the styles. So I'm going to close in the Finder here. I'm going to close the examples. We have our styles. So what we have, I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to delete this because we don't need that. So, so this is kind of a bigger picture kind of thing. It has to do with abstraction and kind of like a separation of concerns or terms you might hear a lot. What this has to do with, we have everything in this one file. It's great, it works, but it's not very scalable or maintainable. Let's say we had 100 components. We wouldn't want to be searching this one file for 100 components. So how do we break that out and make that more maintainable? And so you can look here in our file and you can kind of identify a few different areas. So for instance, we have variables. That's one thing. It could be its own kind of file because variables are their own thing. We also have mixins. They're their own kind of thing, so we can do that. If we ever had a ton of mixins, we could even have specific folders inside the mixins folder for different kinds of mixins. It's however you need to architect the project. It's all depending. And we also have our basic styles, but with our styles, we have kind of two components. We have our loop blocks, and then we have our card list. So we can break those out into component style sheets, which makes those a lot more easy to understand and like figure out whenever you're trying to go through the styles for that component. And you don't have any styles for any other components cluttering your file or window or anything like that. So what I want to show you first, if you guys go to the home page of the repo, you'll see the CSS architecture, ITCSS. You'll go to my version. This is kind of what I used for the first 2 weeks or the first 3 meetups, study groups. And if you go into the styles, this is a little built out. It's not as basic as it could be for beginners. It's definitely a little more built out, but I think you can very easily understand it. It's a lot of small pieces. Like it's literally just a lot of small pieces like this, just broken out into different folders. So it might feel overwhelming and big, but it's truly not. So like for vendor, there's not even anything in vendor. Let's see. So this has to do, I'm not going to go into why these folders are what they are. This has to do with ITCSS. So if you're interested in that, you can go read this link that's also on the front page of the repo. And then that shows you what ITCSS is, why I have the folders named the way I do, and I kind of changed them to my own liking. But this is kind of how you start to break out and use scalable CSS. To answer the question of how do we access these variables from all of these components and all of these mix-ins and all of these things. So imagine we have settings here. Settings is where I put my variables. And this is just a variables file. This is all that's in my variables file. And you might ask, how do I access that everywhere? So it's partials is what it is. And so you would have an entry point, which is your like base style sheet, which is what you're actually going to compile. But in that style sheet, as you can see here, all you're doing is importing everything else you have. So for instance, entry point, it's the main style sheet. It's based off of the ITCSS architecture, which is it's linked here and on the repo. And like I said, with a few personal changes. The very first thing that you always want to import on a project is your variables, because everything else that you have is going to reference those variables. And so essentially this entry point is importing everything we need. So we've got our variables, we've got our mix-ins. Here's another explanation for this particular stack. We're not going to build, I'm going to abstract these things and do them for you instead of just show you them, but we're not going to do it exactly like it is here just because this is a much smaller scale. I want to show you how you could take something that you've built that's really small and still turn that into its own kind of architecture. So next we have our mix-ins, and then we get into kind of the generic styles, and then we get into the component specific styles. And for components, typically everywhere I've seen, all of the devs, the standard is to order the components alphabetically. They don't reference each other, so it doesn't matter that they're called in the order. So it's just nice to have them alphabetically to easily be able to scan up and down with our eyes to know where it is. And then you'll see here I have include any vendor files. That's if you've got any vendor files, which we don't. So that is how we access variables from everywhere. We import them here, and then since we're importing everything else, what this import is technically doing, it's pretty much copying and pasting all those styles that we have right here in this style sheet. And so since we have those variables, now we're calling our components, they all have access to those variables. let me know if anything I just explained about architecture is unclear, or if you still are confused about what we have going on here. Raise your hand. All right, no hands raised. So I think that's understood. So now we're getting close, 8:24. Don't worry about 8:30. I'm not going to cut you guys off. We're just going to keep going. If you need to leave, that's fine. This is recorded. Don't forget. So it's going to be on YouTube probably in the next couple of days. But now what we're going to do is work on abstracting. And I'm going to pull up the Finder for this just because we're going to be creating some folders. If I were on the MacBook, I'd be using the terminal to make these folders, but I don't know the Windows terminal well enough. I think it's similar, but I still don't want to mess with it. I've got some utility functions and stuff on the MacBook too. So we're in I'm Ironclad. So we're going to go into the styles, and we have our SCSS sheet. That's perfectly fine. Now we want to create a new folder. So now we want to kind of think of how we want to abstract these things. Like I said earlier, we have variables, we have mix-ins, and we have components, if you will. So we have the option to do, let's see, I'm going to reopen this tab real quick. We have options to do things like settings, mix-ins, generic, but since it's so small, it's perfectly fine to just make even a new file. Sorry, I didn't mean to make a new folder. Delete that. New. Okay, so maybe I'll just copy and paste this because I don't know if I can. I don't know if you can make a new file like that. Text. Yeah, okay, so anyways. So now we want to rename this to, let's call it variables.scss. Another important thing to note with, I encourage you all to read into SCSS, like actually go in and read it and don't just rely on this just because I'm missing some of the like in the weeds details of how things work. So for partials, you have to have an underscore for it. You have an underscore to kind of tell Sass that it's not a full file. It's just kind of a piece of a file. And it's a piece of our main entry point, which is our styles.scss. So underscore variables SCSS, we're also going to have another one, which is underscore mixins.scss. And then finally, we're going to have multiple components. And so we're actually going to create a component directory or folder, if you will. So now we're going to create a new folder called components. I'm going to copy this file, and then we're going to paste this, and we're going to call this, I think we called it card list. So typically you would name whatever your like parent class name is. That's what you would name the SCSS file, the JavaScript file, and all of the pieces that touch that component. You would all name them the same thing. So we're going to call it card list SCSS because that's the parent class name. And then we're also going to have loop blocks as well. So this is going to be loop blocks. And then I think that's all we're going to have. And so this content, it can technically be its own. We're just going to make this its own its own component as well. So we're going to rename this content.scss. And so now in our style sheet, so let's kind of abstract these things out. You going? All right, Byron, have a good night, man. Oh, I think he already hit it out. All right, so now we want to abstract these things. We created the files. We know where they're going to live. So now let's take our variables and let's take them out of this file. So let's find our components. Nope, don't want that. I want our variables. Hang on. So it gave me .scss.scss. I accidentally added too much to the file name. Oh, didn't mean to do that. So because it's Windows, it doesn't actually show me the file name, so I need to take it off of here. That fixed it. Rename, mixins, rename. Okay, so that's fixed now. Yes. So we just cut our variables and we open the file. So this is, we copied and pasted this file, which is why all these styles are here. So just clear them out. Just Command A and then delete, and then save this. Then we go back to our style sheet, and we would import, it's a string, and then you would say variables.scss. And now what we can do is make sure that this is working by refreshing the page. And as long as it's compiling and everything looks the same, then it should be good to go. And it looks like it is because it's pulling from our variables. So that is successfully abstracted into a variable style sheet. So now we want to abstract our mixins. So let's grab the mixins. Let's go to our mixin style sheet, delete everything because it's a pasted file. And now we have mixins. We can close it. We can close this as well. And now all we want to do is import mixins.scss. Oh, sorry, I had to have the semicolon there. It's going to not compile correctly. So now it's still working perfectly fine because we have imported it. So now what we need to do is abstract these to their individual components. So for the content, let's delete everything here. And here's content, save it. Now we would say import components, content. I'm going to check something real quick. Does that still work? Okay, read into SCSS for this. I may be incorrect, but I'm pretty sure that for the file name itself, you do have to have the underscore, but whenever you import it into SCSS, I don't think that it needs the underscore because it kind of already knows that it's a partial. And you also shouldn't need the SCSS as well, if I'm not mistaken. This might break, so we're going to see. I might be wrong. We're going to see what happens. All right, everything is still working. Oh, wait, we're on example, so that's not the right styles, actually. Here we go, here we go. All right, so this is the right one, and it does still seem to be working. So I think everything is working perfectly fine. So for the file name itself, you have to have an underscore. However, you don't have to have the underscore here because Sass knows already that it's a partial because you're importing it. So now do the same thing, the loop blocks. Go ahead and close this, paste this, save it, and then do loop blocks. And then last but not least, all we have to do is export or abstract, sorry, the card list. So delete, paste, and save, and then minimize this. All we have to do is now change this to card list. Let's refresh and make sure everything is the same. All right, it's all working perfectly fine. So now we have abstracted our single style sheet into a really small scale architecture. And now you can scale this up. If you wanted to add variables, there's only one spot to add them. You'll know where they are. If you want to create new mixins, you know exactly where they are. If you want to create new components, you just create a new file and go crazy. So does everybody understand how we kind of abstracted everything? Did anything not make sense? Let me know if not.